Hi everybody, welcome back to Newton Community Farm. I'm Hope, and today we're going to be talking about gardening. It's Thursday. We didn't put out our regular Wednesday episode yesterday. We got rained on, so we're pushing back filming to today. So welcome to Thursday gardening this week. We're letting Mother Nature call the shots on when we film. Today we're going to be talking all about mulching and how we can use it in our gardens, how we can think about it as a tool as gardeners, and how we can go about doing it. So we have a few examples to show. We're going to do a little loop around the learning garden today and see some different examples of mulch, why we use the different kinds that we use, and how you can incorporate it into your own growing space. So we'll define mulch before we go on a little stroll. Mulch is pretty much any material that is laid or spread on the surface of the soil, and mainly mulch is used for three reasons, but typically there's a lot of benefits as well. Weed suppression is a big one. It saves a lot of time on farms and gardens if we have a mulch laid down to suppress those weeds. Water retention is another reason. So in those dry, hot days of summer that we're in right now, it's a great way to keep water retained into the soil that your plants are sitting in. And then finally, with certain materials, and we'll get into this, mulch can actually decompose and add some nutrients and some other benefits to your soil. So that's mulch, and there's a few different kinds. There's organic and there's inorganic. So that's what we're going to look at on our walk. So let's walk over and look at an example of inorganic. So inorganic is basically any mulch material that doesn't include carbon, and it's anything that would be manufactured. So think of like landscape fabric or tarp or anything that you would lay on the surface of the soil to again suppress weeds. We definitely rely on landscape fabric here for certain plants in certain areas of the farm. And some farmers and gardeners rely on black plastic, and we've talked about this on previous episodes, but the material that we use instead of black plastic is actually biodegradable organic material, and so this is an example of it. So this is kind of our example of inorganic, but it's technically organic. So some farms will use plastic, but that actually breaks down into petroleum bits. So we use this corn gluten material, and it breaks down and actually adds stuff into the soil. So it's not a perfect example of inorganic material, but something like tarp or landscape fabric is. So when we're using a black material like this, it actually warms up the soil, whereas a lot of other mulches help to keep the soil cool in the summer and keep the roots of your plants cool in the summertime. So it's important to remember that distinction when you're choosing your mulch. But this is our example of inorganic. And we'll focus much more heavily on organic mulches in this particular episode. So we'll do a little loop, and there are three main kinds that we'll talk about today. And these are maybe materials that you're already using in your garden, that you're thinking about using in your garden, and they can all kind of be incorporated at different times of the season. And we'll talk about that too. So the first example that we have is going to be wood chips. So like any kind of bark or tree material that's kind of chopped down. You would be familiar with it if you have flower beds. It's a great option for perennials. We use them on our herbs here. And they can be applied at any point in the season. And they're technically organic material, but because they're so dry and woody, they take a while to actually decompose. So when you're using wood chips, you want to think about the next thing that you will be planting in that area of your garden. So for us here, this is a perennial area of the learning garden. So we have lemon balm, which is a perennial. It comes back every year. We have this apple tree, which is obviously perennial and stays there every year. And then we have this newly planted lavender, which will be perennial and will also come back every year. So for wood chips, they're a great option for mulching around plants where you don't anticipate doing that much digging. If you ever tried to dig through a layer of wood chips, it's kind of challenging. And because they don't break down very quickly, they'll last for a number of seasons. And typically gardeners which is what we did here, we'll just replenish our wood chips every year. And when spreading wood chips, and this goes for any kind of organic mulch, at least 2 or 3 inches is kind of the depth that you'll need. 2 inches is like the threshold for when sunlight can penetrate the mulch and germinate weed seed. So like even right here, a weed has poked through. Maybe we were like running out of mulch. It's not too deep. I can get to the soil pretty easily. So I might top it off eventually later on in the season or later on in the growing season. But I'll go through and just kind of pick out the weeds that I see. And yeah, that's mulch. It's great for flower beds. It's great for anything that's perennial, like I said. Kind of more established areas of your garden will do well with mulch. So let's keep moving. We'll take a look at a few other examples, and we'll take a look at an example of what happens when you don't use mulch. We definitely have that going on over here. So here's another area. I actually specifically remember running out of mulch in this area. So you can see that there's weeds poking up through here. And again, this is a perennial area. So mint, which comes back every year. You can see more lemon balm. This big monstrous tree, and all of these herbs in the rocks. This is all stuff that comes back every year. So again, I would go through and kind of like pull out any weeds that I see. I would want to do that before putting more mulch on, kind of just like take out all the weeds before trying to suppress them again. And right over here you can see another example of inorganic mulch. So this is landscape fabric, and this can be recycled and reused season after season. It's pretty hardy. But this was what was down in this area last year, and my ambition has been to move that out of the way and incorporate more organic materials, which in this case I'm using wood chips. So you can actually see these are all like weed roots that ended up kind of dying back as I pulled this off the soil. And like sometimes the weeds will make their way through any like little holes or perforations in the material. But you pull it back and it all dies in the sun anyways. So landscape fabric definitely has its place, but I'm a fan of the kind of pretty wood chip look. So let's move on to the next material. We're going to talk about straw and hay and the place that can have in mulching your garden. And before we make our way over there, we'll see an example of a not mulched area and what that looks like. So over here we have a big patch of nothing planted and nothing mulched. So what you're seeing in this kind of forest here is all weeds. Weeds that should be cleared soon because they're going to seed and will continue to reseed themselves, and they'll likely be worse next year. So if this had been mulched in the beginning of the season, it wouldn't look like that. It would look more like what we just saw with the mulch near the perennials. And if I had planted anything here and not attended to the weeds, they would be competing with my crops. So that's pretty much the mentality with laying down mulch, is, you know, suppressing any competition with your crops primarily. So we'll bushwhack through here. And the first crop that we're gonna find is garlic. So I think this side-by-side image is helpful to see kind of what it would look like if we hadn't used this straw to mulch down this garlic. So this was planted last fall. The cloves were put in the soil and the straw was laid on top, and it covered the soil throughout the winter. And then, I mean, I haven't had to do anything with this garlic. That's kind of the beauty of garlic. But I have the straw to thank for that minimal work that I have to do for the garlic. And if I hadn't used the straw, it would look like this all around the garlic. And I either would have had to weed it out consistently through the summer as it continued to grow, or it would be actively competing with the garlic. So you can see it's like just about as high as most of my garlic at this point. So I'm very grateful that I don't have to be weeding it regularly and the garlic doesn't have to be competing. So straw breaks down, it's kind of in between materials. So something like wood chips will take a pretty long time to break down, straw a little less, and we'll look at leaf mulch at the end, which breaks down probably the fastest. So straw can be used, you know, season after season. It can be moved pretty easily, which is beneficial. This is salt marsh hay, so it's an organic material that we're sourcing in, and we use it on the garlic in the field. We use it in different areas around the farm, so it's very beneficial. It helps to, like I said, kind of keep the soil cool, retain moisture for the plants in the summer, and mainly weeds. And we use it in our no-till beds on top of our cover crop that we mow. So cover crops can be a great mulch as well. You can just mow it over in the spring and plant right into it. And then, you know, if it's not thick enough, if it's not that 2 or 3 inches thick, you can add something like leaves or straw on top. And I would say a big benefit of the straw is that it can be pretty easily moved. Whereas something that breaks down quickly, like grass clippings, that can kind of get soggy and difficult to move around. Although I know people like to use that sometimes. So that's hay. That's stop number 2 on the tour. Let's move over to stop number 3. You're getting a view of the more jungly side of the learning garden. And then this is the area where we will be using the final form of mulch. So this is leaf clippings. And what I'm doing here, so these are 2 rows of peppers, and then we get into our tomatoes. So these are longer season crops. And longer season crops are really great candidates for mulch. They tend to, as the name longer crop suggests, they tend to be in the soil for a while. So these pepper plants and these tomato plants have been in for over a month, maybe 2 now. I'm losing track of the days. But they're not quite the same as garlic, but similarly they can be planted and kind of left alone to take their time to mature. And using a mulch of any kind really can help to reduce the work that you need to do for those given plants. So it's why I use this material, this black material, under the tomatoes. It creates that like hot environment on top of the soil in between the plastic and the soil to kill any weeds. So I'm going to do the same thing here in these pathways. Because it's easy enough to weed around the plants in the bed, but it can be a lot of added work to weed your pathways. So that, that's another option for using mulch, not just around plants, but in the area where you want to walk, and you can kind of forget about it, and you don't have to weed it regularly. So what I did to prep for this area is between these 2 rows of peppers, I weeded just earlier today. So you'll probably see some dead weeds that have been uprooted. And you can do that by hand, you can use a tool. I use this wheel hoe, which is a really useful piece of equipment for pulling weeds up quickly. And once the weeds are cleared, you're ready to lay your mulch. So I'm gonna show you how that looks with leaves in particular. These leaves are super dry. Our leaf pile is on the other side of the farm, and it's open to the elements, so if it gets rained on, it's already pretty moist when we lay it down. This is pretty dry just from the heat we've been getting, so yeah, it's worth noting that. So a pitchfork is great for spreading mulch. It's easy, it makes it easy to pick up the material, whether it's straw or leaves. I'd probably use a rake for wood chips, but whatever you have should work. So what I would typically do for a larger area is fill a wheelbarrow with it and create little piles and then spread out the piles. So with any material, like I said, it should be about 3 inches so that you don't end up having to go through and weed the areas that you've mulched. It kind of defeats the purpose. So what I would do is just kind of spear a little mound and drop it into the pathway. And I would go down the path like this, just kind of filling the fort and filling in the space that I want mulch on. And I would go down, I would be super liberal with it because I'd rather use extra than not enough. So I'd go down the pathway and fill in this whole stretch, cover all that soil. And then I would go through either with my hands or my feet or my tool. I would go through and kind of just make sure it's all spread out, make sure it's deep enough. I might have to add another layer, but this looks pretty good to me. And especially once we get some rain this afternoon or tonight, it'll help to kind of mat it down and incorporate it into this soil. And that's about the secret of laying down mulch. It's pretty simple. And one thing to note, so keeping in mind that you want it to be deep, but keeping in mind that you also want to give your plants a little bit of space, especially with hay, but with any organic material that's going to decompose. It can trap a lot of moisture around the base of your plant if it's kind of right up hugging the stem, which can actually lead to rot on your plant, which isn't really something that we need. So I would give my peppers like a few inches, an inch or two, just so that, you know, it's not constantly in contact with something that's holding water, which means that I'll have to go through every now and then and kind of pick out any weeds that are germinating along the base of the plant. But compared to how much space there was to weed before I laid mulch, it won't be too much work. And I would have done that same thing with my tomato plants, but I will just mulch them up to the edge of the plastic, and that's all I'll have to do. It's using 2 different kinds of mulch to get the job done. And with organic mulch, it's going to break down over time, and as it does, it will add more organic material to your soil. It will help with water drainage, and it just improves the overall soil structure in your growing space. And it also invites earthworms, especially with leaves. I notice a lot of earthworms coming back to the soil, which is great. So there's all sorts of benefits with any kind of mulch that you use, and hopefully this is a helpful guide to get you started or to add to your garden as you go. You can kind of add at any point throughout the season, always thinking about what's going to be planted next. And you're on your way. Thanks for tuning in. Check back next Wednesday and we'll talk more about gardening. Bye.